Stoneman, Executive Director of the Beaches Museum. I want to welcome you to the Beaches Museum Chapel. Raise your hand if it's your first time inside the chapel. I love it. Thank you for being here. It's your first, but it will certainly not be your last. As you will learn, we have a lot of programming that happens here at the Beaches Museum. I want to start by thanking you guys for coming out under threat of who knows what this weather is going to do, but I just looked at the radar and it should be hailing out here by the time we go to leave after this lecture. So I think we have some umbrellas in the closet, but sit tight. We got enough wine probably to keep us through if you need to hunker down here in the chapel. We're in a church, deconsecrated church. Is it the right time to mention that? But we're gonna stay dry and warm in here. I want to thank our museum members. Raise your hand if you're a museum member. Awesome. Thank you so much. Museum members are the lifeblood of what we do because we are a nonprofit organization. So thank you for helping make everything we do possible. If you'd like to be a museum member or learn more, we can help you with that back at the back table, or myself will be happy to help you. I want to thank our volunteers, Reggie at the bar, everybody's favorite volunteers, the bartender, and then Vicky at check-in. You got applause, Reggie. So please feel free to hit the bar, grab some cheese and crackers during the program. If you need to avail yourselves of the facilities, those of you who are new here, they are in our 1873 cabin across the way. Don't worry, it's not the original restroom. We have modern facilities there, but if it's pouring outside, you may just want to hold it. We also have surveys, so if you have any feedback you'd like to give us about the program, they're on the back table as you're leaving. It's really quick. It'll take you 30 seconds to fill out. We'd love to know what you think, as well as if you have any other ideas for topics. We really try to make our topics for the Boardwalk talks pertinent to what's going on today, what's going on perhaps in our museum. If you don't know, the actual museum building is 2 blocks down. And so that's really where we find ourselves today. March is Women's History Month, and 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. It's not that long ago, people. It's not that long ago. So young ladies in the group, you have that right now. Please use it. Exercise. All of us exercise that right. But what we did for March was to plan a whole month of programming that had to do with recognizing women, women's history, and women's right to vote. So in addition to today's program, we have an exhibit opening tomorrow that is called Ballot and the Brush, an abstract, it's something long, but it's really clever. Something about women's suffrage. Ballot and the Brush, that's the cute part. And that opens tomorrow, and it's 3 abstract expressionists, Sarah Conca, Tiffany Manning, and Princess Simpson Rashid. So the wine is of equal quality as what we have here, but the food is better. So from 6 to 8, that's open to anyone. It's the same as here, free for our members, and $5 optional donation from anyone else who wishes to attend. So we'd love to see you. We do them on Friday nights now, so you stop by on your way to dinner or whatever you want to do. On March 16th, we have Mama Blue playing right here as part of our chapel concert series. Does anybody already have their ticket? They are sold out. I was going to say, if you guys need to jump someone in the parking lot on the way out, but I guess nobody here has a ticket. I know, they are. There is a wait list, but she's wonderful, and she's going to play a concert of all female songwriters and songs made famous by females. So we're very excited about that. And then not sold out is the Rich Chamber Players on Wednesday the 18th, and they are playing a concert that is called She is Silent No More, and it'll delve into women composers who, as you can imagine, were not nearly as recognized as male composers in classical music. So we're going to have that right here on March 18th. No tickets required, so we invite you to come to that. If you want to know more about all of our events, make sure we have your email address. If you're not getting our emails, let us know. But we put everything on our website, social media, Beaches Leader. You can readily find anything you need there. I want to thank Fleet Landing for not only sending the group out today, but also for sponsoring our Boardwalk Talk series. And they're really, that sponsorship is really enabling us to bring in a super high quality speaker, no pressure, here to our Boardwalk Talk. So I want to introduce Dr. Peggy Macdonald. She is a public historian and adjunct professor at Stetson University and Indian River State College. She's a native Floridian. She gives presentations on Florida women's history with the Florida Humanities Council, which is how we found out about her. Her publications include a biography of environmental activist Marjorie Harris and a forthcoming book on Florida's female pioneers. Dr. Macdonald has written about local and Florida history and culture for Gainesville Magazine, Our Town Magazine, Senior Times, and Forum Magazine. I get Forum Magazine, that's a great publication. She serves on the Alachua County Historical Commission and is an alumna of the University of Florida, go Gators, where she received a PhD in American History 2010. Dr. Macdonald served as Executive Director of the Matheson History Museum from 2015 to 2019. So please welcome Dr. Macdonald to speak about Florida's female pioneers.
Well, what I'm about to do would have been scandalous at the time of these female pioneers to speak from the pulpit. So thank you for inviting me to speak. And the idea for this topic of women in Florida who achieved historic firsts came to me when I was the executive director of the Matheson History Museum in Gainesville. And I learned about a woman who was allegedly the first female physician, and that was Dr. Sarah Lucretia Robb. And you can see her here with her Victorian cottage, which still exists. It's been relocated. It's across the street from the First Presbyterian Church in downtown Gainesville. You can see her here with her horse Ben, and she would go around Alachua County delivering babies and tending to the sick. And I thought, wow, she really was the first female physician in Florida. That's pretty interesting. Let's look that up. So conveniently, at the Matheson, there's an archives and a library, and I found, there's a delay, I found this book proving that actually Dr. Sarah Lucretia Robb was the first female physician in Alachua County, but not in Florida. So Dr. Esther Hill Hawks was an early woman to graduate with a medical degree in the United States. She graduated in 1857 from New England Female Medical College in Boston, the first college to grant women degrees. She wasn't the first woman to achieve a medical degree, however, from a U.S. medical school. That was Elizabeth Blackwell, who was admitted to Geneva College of Medicine. What Dr. Blackwell didn't realize when she showed up for class was that her letter of acceptance was intended to be a joke. And over time, however, she earned the respect of her male fellow students and professors and graduated at the top of her class. Now, in this book, A Woman Doctor's Civil War, this is a collection of not all, but some of Dr. Esther Hill Hawks' letters from when she was in South Carolina during the war and in Florida after the war, and she wrote eloquently about the St. Johns River, less eloquently about the hostility that the Southern women showed to Yankee women like her. Now, after graduating, within 4 years, the Civil War began. She volunteered her services as a doctor, but she was rejected because of her gender. Everyone knows someone with a penis makes a much better doctor. Now, in addition, she was rejected as a nurse because of Dorothea Dix's policy as superintendent of Army nurses that female nurses needed to be at least 35, plain looking, and would wear a drab nurse's uniform. Now, clearly, she was devastatingly beautiful and could not serve as a nurse. She was also in her late 20s, so it just wouldn't have worked. Now, what is this all about? When we see prescriptive literature, such as this book, Dr. Edwin Clark's Sex in Education, how do you get a book to sell? Put sex as the first word in the title. Sex in Education, a fair chance for the girls. Now, it sounds like he was in favor of higher education for women. But actually, in this book, he wrote that when women go to college and they study and they think big ideas, and they talk with other women about big ideas, and they read, it just sucks the blood up out of their ovaries and into their brains, and they become sterile. Now, in this book, which went through multiple editions, there's even a case although Dr. Clark was not present at the autopsy, where he reported of a case of death by college. Now again, with prescriptive literature like this, what this means is it's a reaction against women attending college in droves, especially after the Civil War. And so Dr. Esther Hill Hawks was one of those women. She just had trouble after graduating from New England Female Medical College and receiving placement as a doctor. So she and her husband, Dr. John Milton Hawks, moved to the cleverly titled Hospital Number 10 in South Carolina. Now, this was a really monumental undertaking. Hospital Number 10 was designed to care for the freedmen who had run away toward Union lines, and they became the first official so-called colored troops for the Union Army during the Civil War. So we hear about the Massachusetts 54th, the South Carolina 1st Volunteers were actually the first official so-called colored troops. Now, in addition to receiving medical care at this hospital, the South Carolina area for freedmen had a school. So although Dr. Hawks, the female Dr. Hawks, was not able to serve as a doctor or a nurse, she did serve as a teacher at an early version of a Freedmen's Bureau school. Now this is Gainesville's Freedmen's Bureau School, but just to give you a sense of what it might have looked like, right? The school where Dr. Hawks taught. After the Civil War, Dr. Hawks and her husband, Dr. Hawks, wanted to continue their work with freedmen. So they moved to Florida with other Union officers with the goal of establishing a Freedmen's Colony. So the idea was that by purchasing land, including extensive orange groves, this would be a self-sustaining colony for freedmen and their families. Esther Hill Hawks opened up a school, which may be the first biracial school in the nation here in Jacksonville, when it was occupied by the Union Army. Now, even though the Union Army was occupying Jacksonville, the idea of biracial education was not popular with Jacksonville residents, so Dr. Hawks moved with her husband to the colony they established, which he named Port Orange, in the Daytona Beach area. So this was originally a freedmen's colony. And this is where the Hawkses had their extensive orange groves. Dr. Hawks also opened up, John Milton Hawks, who went by Milton, opened up a lumber company, and his wife opened her second school that was biracial in Florida. Unfortunately, in 1869, because of opposition to interracial learning, the school was torched. Now, Esther returned to the north where she practiced medicine, and she would winter here with her husband, who established a town called Hawksville, where the Freedmen's Colony actually failed because it was hard to farm in Florida. We all know what the soil is like, right? This is back when, if you see pictures of Florida in the late 1800s, you don't see grass, right? They're not using agriculture that's contaminating the water in Florida. It was very sandy soil, and although the Hawks' citrus did well, the colony itself fell apart. But Dr. Hawks focused on his community of Hawksville, which later became Edgewater. This is a 19th century remote. So this is a stereograph from the Matheson History Museum's collections of citrus in Florida from about the 1890s. And here we see another Yankee couple, abolitionist couple, who relocated to Florida. Of course, you all know here, right, to Mandarin. And again, the idea was to have these extensive oranges. So this is a theme we see. Oranges attracting people, especially from the north, to come to Florida, lead the easy life, right, with the oranges, and also to write. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose husband bears a striking resemblance to the rock star Sting. I think we need Henry Louis Gates promptly to establish the genetic connection. But at Mandarin, this is a stereograph showing a citrus tree at their successful plantation former cotton plantation became orange grove. We see that Harriet Beecher Stowe described the orange as the fairest, the noblest, the most generous. It is the most surprising and abundant of all trees. The sentence continues with no punctuation, but she wrote eloquently about North Florida, about the St. Johns River, about oranges, which she called golden apples. She wrote so eloquently about North Florida that she spawned the Snowbird Industry. So, known of course for Uncle Tom's Cabin from 1852, her 1873 book, Palmetto Leaves, it increased the Florida tourism industry exponentially. And what did people do when they came to Florida? They went to the wharf at Palmetto, and pre-Disney, this was already set up as a tourist trap, right? So we see here the snowbirds dressed in their winter gear, right? This is snowbird season. The ideal time to travel up the Ocklawaha River was January through April, and we could see them dressed accordingly. So there would be photographers waiting at the wharf of Palaka. So as you aboard the, in this case, the Osceola, the steamer, that you would have your picture taken, and then you could share it with your loved ones, your friends, and more people would want to come to Florida. This is part of Hubbard Hart's marketing scheme. So he designed these narrow boats to go on the Ocklawaha River. In fact, when Harriet Beecher Stowe came here, she heard she had to go to the Ocklawaha. When she took one look at the early steamers that Hubbard Hart had crafted, she didn't want to go on them. And she actually wrote about them and described them as floating caskets. Her writing changed, however, and her writing about the St. John's and this subtropical paradise that people could experience when they came to Florida, it tempted people to ride the steamers and shoot at anything that moved. Here we can see this gentleman is not even pointing at the alligator. It's clearly already dead, right? But Jack Davis writes in his biography of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas that by the 1880s in Florida, 2.5 million alligators had been harvested. And he compares it to this destruction going on at the same time out west with the buffalo. Another Yankee who came to North Florida, now we call her a Yankee, right? She's actually from Washington, D.C., but for my students I teach at Stetson, I noticed that anything north of Florida is the north. This is actually not at Cross Creek. This is at her Crescent Beach cottage. So after Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings won the Pulitzer Prize for The Yearling, people traveled to Cross Creek to watch her write. Not very good for writing, so she would escape to her beach cottage. And that image was courtesy of the University of Florida Special Collections. This is from the Matheson. This is a painting of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' home that she and her husband, Charles Rawlings, purchased in 1928, and the building's from about 1890. Now, when Marjorie came to Florida, she immediately fell in love with it. To her, it felt like home, and it inspired her writing like nothing else had or ever would. Charles hated it. He left. Their marriage ended in divorce, but really Rawlings won the Pulitzer, so who cares? Now this is another 1880s, 1890s stereograph. This is from the collection of J. Whitworth, and he's donated these images to the museum, the Matheson. And you can see how tall the orange trees used to grow, right? This is Cross Creek before Rawlings, but this is the land she wrote about. This is the Axline House. It's still right across from Rawlings' house in Cross Creek, but it's an example of the wealth that citrus brought to Florida. So here in this house, you can see in front the buggy, right, the horse. So Axline was another Yankee who purchased orange groves in Florida and had a home. Now, Cross Creek was a center for citrus. There was such wealth, they even had a band, right? So this is one of my favorite images, the band at Cross Creek. This is from J. Whitworth as well. Now, Rawlings came after this golden era of citrus, but she also had citrus groves at her home. Now, North Florida's golden age of citrus really ended with the freezes of the 1890s, where there was a series of freezes in 1894 and 95, and another in 1899 where it dipped to -2 in Tallahassee. And there was frost on the ground at Key West. So previously, Alachua and Marion counties produced most of Florida's citrus, and after that, it went farther and farther south. We can't go any farther now, so it's in Brazil. Now here we can see Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings really crossed that line between observing a subculture and becoming part of it. So without the Florida cracker, she wouldn't have had as much to write about. And she was in awe of their noble daily struggle to survive. Here we can see her crabbing at Salt Springs, but she also would shoot and kill and cook deliciously, federally protected birds, right? She would use dynamite to go fishing, right, with her cracker friends. So she really was part of that subculture. Here she is writing and smoking at the same time, a lost art. And in 1942, you could see, this is at a Jacksonville department store, you could see that she had fans from the military. So as sailors and general enlistees were waiting to storm D-Day or were involved in other military actions to keep their mind off of what was about to happen, there were classic works of literature that were produced and were shared. They're pocket size. So Rawlings' literature was among them, but there were other writers as well. And in this case, we could see how popular her writing was with enlistees. And she would receive fan mail from around the world during World War II. And it reminded soldiers and sailors, her writing reminded them of home. And they said, could you please write more about food? So she did. In 1942, her autobiographical book, Cross Creek, came out. And then also in 1942, she produced Cross Creek Cookery, where she shows these federally protected birds in a pie about to be baked. Now, here things are starting to go south, quite literally. Florence Turcott, who's the literary manuscripts archivist at the University of Florida Special Collections, she told me she doesn't remember saying it, but she did. She said Rawlings could have used a bra. Now, a little Women's History Month bra history that I did related to my master's degree about a woman in St. Petersburg who was a grandmother and according to the family owned a bomb factory. Her name is C.E. Quinn. There were studies, of course, commissioned by Maidenform during World War II that looked at the women working in the factories, the Rosie the Riveters, to see did the women who wore bras have any benefits. And the studies concluded that women who wore bras to the factory during World War II felt more refreshed at the end of the day. So ladies, as you put on your bra in the morning, you're being patriotic. Now the reason Rawlings might have been looking down in that picture is that after Cross Creek was published in 1942, a woman she thought was her friend, and this is the most attractive picture you'll find of her. This is Zelma Kaysen. She's described in Rawlings' book as an angry and efficient canary, as a spinster with the mouth of a sailor who would like to manage everyone's affairs. Well, Kaysen didn't appreciate that, and she went to another Florida female pioneer, Kate Walton, who's among the first women to graduate from the University of Florida College of Law in 1936 and be admitted to the Florida bar. She was the first woman attorney in Putnam County. And she was one of the attorneys who represented Zelma Kaysen, and on appeal, Kaysen won in what's called the invasion of privacy lawsuit, a trend-sending lawsuit, and Rawlings had to pay a fine of $1. But as Florence Turcott told me, Rawlings also pledged never to write about Florida again, and it really was the end of her writing career. She died at age 57 in 1953, too young. This is the courthouse, the 1885 courthouse in Alachua County, where the trial took place. Now, keep in mind that at the time, the legal status of a woman was nil, right? Because of coverture, a woman had no legal identity. So actually, the person who was sued was not Rawlings, but her husband, Norman Baskin, and This was the site of the earliest O.J. Simpson type trial, right? The reporters were there every day to report on what Rawlings was wearing. It really upset her, and the drinking helped lead to her death. Now, Rawlings is the first of the Florida's three Marjories I'm discussing. So Marjorie Harris Carr will be the next. Here we could see a picture of a young Marjorie Harris in Bonita Springs, which I drove through the other day. It doesn't look like this anymore. Here in the corner you can see the house that her father built, a little cracker-style cottage, although actually Marjorie Harris and her family were from Boston in Southwest Florida. They moved there in 1918. She grew up there. Imagine, she had a Boston accent, her hair cropped short, rolled up her pants to ride her horse Chiquita all around Bonita Springs. That horse was her only friend. Now here we see an alligator head. This is Marjorie is the youngest in the center. So I mentioned about the devastation wrought on nature. Well, Marjorie Harris's parents were naturalists, and they taught her about how to identify thousands of Florida fauna and flora, and they instilled a conservation ethos in her. So they would drive around Bonita Springs near Fort Myers and look at the turpentine activities. And they would lament in front of Marjorie how, of course, after the turpentine process is over, the tree dies, how more trees, new trees were not planted. Marjorie Harris Carr said later in an oral history interview that she remembered as a child seeing the orange glow of the Everglades burning as the land was cleared for agriculture. So this instilled a sense in her of what was going wrong in Florida, but more than that, she was born in 1915, arrived in Florida in 1918, died in 1997, so she lived for most of the 20th century in Florida, in South Florida and later North Florida, and observed the changes, especially after World War II, when there was rapid development. She wondered, what could she do, right? There are problems, environmental challenges around the world, but she thought, here in my backyard, I can make a difference. In 1936, you can see she graduated from Florida State College for Women. She was a member of the Phi Beta Kappa. She was an honor student, charter member of the Florida Academy of Sciences and Sigma Psi Honor Society. And yet, when she applied to the PhD program at Cornell in ornithology, the director, Arthur Allen, told her point blank that women were not welcome in the field. So she wound up at the last moment getting a position as the first female federal wildlife technician at the Willaca National Fish Hatchery, which happened to have an aviary. So she was still able to work with birds, and through this position, she met the two great loves of her life. One was the romantic Ocklawaha River, is what the postcard says. You can see this early Photoshop version of an alligator looking quizzically, pensively at the Ocklawaha and the birds flying by. So in 1936, Marjorie Carr got to know the Ocklawaha River in a relatively unspoiled state. The second great love of her life was Archie Carr, and when they met, he was finishing his PhD at the University of Florida. He became the first PhD in biology at UF, and typically when a woman scientist married a man, any man, it was professional suicide. But not in the case of Archie Carr. He supported her work. Now, unfortunately, not everyone supported her work. When she told at the fish hatchery, she told her supervisor that a colleague had taken credit for her discovery, and the supervisor fired her. So, of course, they eloped to the Everglades. That's the rational thing to do. He was only making $40 a month as a PhD student. He had his finances down to how many cigarettes he could roll by hand. He could not afford a wife. But he intervened and helped Marjorie get a job at the Jack Bass Zoological Research Supply Company in Englewood. And so she concealed her marriage for about the first 6 months of their marriage, because if she had revealed that she and Archie were married, she would lose her job. During the Depression, even teachers, right, in a feminized industry were required to, quote, retire if they got married. So retire in your 20s, right? And that's a time when a teaching job became more lucrative in a man's eyes. Now here you can see she's, again, 21, recently married to Archie Carr, who swept her off her feet. She's handling a blue indigo snake, not even looking at it, right? And as her daughter, Mimi Carr, who let me scan all these photos and let me interview her over a period of years, has noted, look how gently she's holding this snake. This is Luther Goldman, who became a National Geographic wildlife photographer. He's not looking at his rattlesnake either, so things were good. Jumping forward in time from the Great Depression to the late 1950s, Marjorie and Archie Carr had 5 children together. When the youngest was school age, Marjorie was free to pursue a new career. She could not work formally as a scientist, as a zoologist, because of the times. But she became active with the Garden Club, and she formed the Alachua Audubon Society with colleagues. And one of her first projects was to preserve Paynes Prairie State Park, which was in private hands at the time. It took over a decade. Another project is Lake Alice at the University of Florida campus. Today, it's the crown jewel of one of the best things to do in Gainesville, aside from see Paynes Prairie. But at the time, the University of Florida had no sewage treatment plant, and they poured all the effluent directly into the lake. And as you can see, the hydrilla were prolific. Well, University of Florida and Florida Department of Transportation, without any public hearings or any input at all from the community, went forward with plans to drain portions of the lake, build a 4-lane cross-campus throughway, and a 2,000-car parking lot. Not parking garage, 2,000-car parking lot. When Marjorie Carr and Archie Carr and some of their colleagues from the biology department at the University of Florida found out about this, they intervened. Joe Little, who was a new untenured law professor, stood face-to-face with then U.S. President Stephen C. O'Connell, who told Professor Little it was a done deal. However, Marjorie Carr and others worked to bring this to the attention of the public. They demanded public hearings, and Marjorie used her clout with state newspapers, and there are St. Petersburg Times articles that show that this little pond, which really it is, in Gainesville was major news, right? Draining the lake and building the cross-campus throughway. Today, it looks like this, and there are weddings there. I have mine there. There are memorial services, and it's a guaranteed place to go and see an alligator. But Marjorie Carr is best known for her work to stop the Cross-Florida Barge Canal. This is an early version, the Cross-Florida Ship Canal, which was constructed, portions were constructed during the Great Depression. But the idea was just FDR was willing to try anything to help stimulate the economy, including paying young men to ineffectively build these bridge stanchions that would go over a ship canal. When the United States started to become the arsenal for democracy and to build munitions for the Allies, this stopped, right? There was no more money to waste on projects like this. However, between 1942 and 1962, the project was never deauthorized. So, again, with no public input, in 1962, one of Carr's colleagues from the Florida Garden Club, Florida Federation of Garden Clubs, let her know that here in Jacksonville, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was moving forward with plans to dam the Ocklawaha River to construct this canal. And now we have the angry rain coming down as I'm talking about this. I'm skipping forward. This shows in this map the completed sections of the canal. The canal was about 1/3 complete. When Marjorie Carr and others, including David Anthony, started their work to oppose the route of the barge canal across the Ocklawaha, and later to oppose the project altogether. When they first started this, there was no support from most of the Florida newspapers. Most Florida papers supported the project. This environmental impact statement, one of the early environmental impact statements in Florida and across the nation, changed that. So most Florida newspapers were against the project after they received this information, which made the case that economically, scientifically, culturally, historically, and morally, the Ocklawaha River deserved to be preserved. This is something she worked toward until her death in 1997 to achieve. However, the remnants of this defunct dam project that provides no power, there's not a hydroelectric dam, right? The remnants still scar the Ocklawaha River. And she would encourage you to find out more and to find out what you can do. And you could go to Florida Defenders of the Environment to check out their activities. That's the organization she co-founded. Here she's with, this is Marjorie Carr with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who's the third of Florida's three Marjories I'm going to talk about. Does anyone know who the gentleman on the right is? He's no longer with us. I used to trick or treat in his neighborhood. It's Dr. Michael Gannon. He's one of the founders of Florida history. He was a Catholic priest who gave up the cloth to get married and to become a historian. During the student anti-war movement, when there were big demonstrations at the University of Florida, he literally put himself between the police and tear gas and students. There are photos of it. He also wrote about World War II when the German saboteurs were deposited off the coast of Florida, and he wrote extensively about Spanish Florida, especially St. Augustine. He's to blame for ruining everyone's notions of Thanksgiving taking place in Massachusetts. We all know. Thanks to Michael Gannon, we all know it took place here in Florida. Now, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, this is when she's a young Wellesley College student. She came to Florida before Marjorie Carr. She arrived in 1915. She'd had a bad marriage. She wasn't quite sure what to do. Her mother had died. And she contacted her father, who happened to own the newspaper that became the Miami Herald. And so he encouraged her to come to Florida. And Jack Davis, as I mentioned, wrote her biography. If you'd like to know more, it's over 700 pages long. It's useful as a door prop as well. But it's not only a biography of Douglas, it's also the history of the Everglades and the history of the Florida environmental movement. It won the Gold Prize for the Florida Book Awards, and also he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Gulf. So it's definitely worth checking out. But another scholar I'll tell you about is Dr. Kimberly Wilmot Voss. She teaches at University of Central Florida, and she's a pioneer in the field of journalism history, women's journalism history. And what she would tell you about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, aside from the fact that she liked to drink scotch with her friends later in life, was that she wrote for the women's pages. So because of working for her father in Miami, she had a special platform, a special column where she could write about whatever issues she chose to write about. The idea with the women's pages that people would write about weddings and society and fashion, but as Kimberly Voss points out, the women's page reporters knew that their male editors were not reading anything they wrote in the women's pages, so they wrote whatever they wanted. Douglas wrote about a variety of causes, including suffrage, but ultimately wrote about the Everglades. She wrote about the need to limit the height of condos because it was spoiling people's views. Now, this is similar to the images we have of people enjoying the St. John's or the Ocklawaha River. This is the excursion boat Sally on the Everglades. This is another Matheson History Museum image. So you can see snowbirds enjoying the Everglades, which is good, because most people at the time who lived in Florida viewed the Everglades as a wasteland. And this is, again, something Jack Davis talks about. If you could not, quote, improve the land, it was a wasteland, right? So Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, in 1947, through writing River of Grass, this eloquent book about the Everglades that opens by saying there is no other Everglades in the world. She thought, I wrote the book, I'm done, but although it did become the Bible for Florida environmentalists in the 1960s and 70s, in 1969 she was recruited to help stop what was touted as the world's largest airport in the heart of the Everglades. Now, at the time she was 79. She lived to be 108. She had a lot of fight left in her. With her Quaker influence, she founded Friends of the Everglades, and like Carr, she fought until her death to educate people. I once spoke with someone who said he would invite her to speak in South Florida about her writing, and she would speak for maybe 5 minutes about her book, and she launched into sermonizing about saving the Everglades. And here she is enjoying her life towards the end. Now, another woman who was here in Florida at the time when women did not have the right to vote was Mae Jennings, who there's an effort, seems year after year, to get her added to the Florida Women's Hall of Fame. Maybe this year will be the year, with the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Let's hope so. Here she is as the First Lady of Florida from 1901 to 1905. Lovely woman. She was known, oh, we all get older, a little fatter. She was known as Florida's most powerful woman, and it wasn't because she was First Lady. This was later in her life. This was because she was president of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs from 1914 to 1917, when there were over 10,000 members. Now, keep in mind, at the time there were fewer than 1 million residents in Florida. It was the least populous city east of the Mississippi. And she used her clout to convince the Federation, the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, that they should endorse suffrage. Now, at the time, 1914, when Mae Jennings started as the president of the Federation, suffrage was controversial, especially in the South. And the higher-ups, right, the leadership of the Federation and the heads of the local clubs thought that if they endorsed suffrage, it would be too political, and it would take away from the women's work with the Seminoles, for the Everglades, for schools. The women's clubs established the first public libraries in many communities across the state. Well, Jennings convinced them otherwise, and in 1915, the Federation moved forward and started to lobby the Florida legislature to amend the state constitution to allow Florida women to vote. The Florida legislature dug its heels in. To give you the short version, after June 4th, 1919, when the 19th Amendment was passed, there were, I came across a Gainesville Daily Sun newspaper headline 2 days later that said very optimistically they expected that Florida would be the first state to ratify. 50 years later, in 1969, Florida symbolically ratified the 19th Amendment, along with many southern states. Now, the idea was not just that, you know, the sexism taking place, right? There were white men in charge of the legislature who were concerned that adding the right to vote, giving women the suffrage, would mean that both black and white women would be voting, and this was very controversial. Nonetheless, in August 1920, the 19th Amendment went into effect, and we had women voting in Florida. Oh, and that's why we had Mae Jennings. She was one of the co-founders of the Florida League of Women Voters. This is 1913 in Orlando, this delightful car with this really fun steering wheel. And if you look, you can't see from where you're sitting, but it actually says on the banner, equal suffrage. So in Orlando, there was a small group of women who responded to the mayor's call that all freeholders should register to vote for an upcoming municipal election. When these women showed up, nobody knew what to do. The city officials were flummoxed. They sent them to the mayor. He sent them to the city attorney, who said definitively that according to the Florida Constitution, women did not have the right to vote. Well, in 1912, these women felt like this was a clear example of taxation without representation. And Mary Safford, an experienced suffragist, established the Orlando Equal Suffrage League. Then she became president of the Florida Equal Suffrage League, and the momentum continued to build. So moving forward, I have another talk about suffrage, so I have to stop myself. But this is an early image from the Harper's Weekly showing poaching, right? So in Florida, entire rookeries were wiped out. The parents were harvested for their plumage. You see right now the egrets, the male egrets have that beautiful mating plumage. We all get a little excited when we see them, right, with that plumage. Well, they would leave the poor young to die, right? And this is because of a not just national but international fashion of wearing feathers, parts of birds, and whole dead birds on women's hats. So why am I showing you this? Club women, such as the ones that Jennings worked with as president of the Federation, educated, right? They didn't storm the stage when a presidential hopeful was speaking. They didn't throw blood on people, right? They educated through the women's pages. Why this had to stop? And because of these women, we have egrets today. Speaking of egrets, this was considered fashionable. This is at the Museum of the Everglades in Everglades City. This is a specimen that's over 100 years old. It's a fan. Now, here we see Mae Jennings. This is her husband, William Sherman Jennings, who was governor 1901 to 1905. William Jennings Bryan, who was his cousin, and of course ran unsuccessfully for president 3 times, both on the Democratic and the populist ticket, and was associated with the Scopes trial. We don't need to say anything more about that. Speaking of Jennings and her clout, so her husband, as governor, supported Everglades drainage. It was one of his main issues. Here you can see they're at a drainage canal. She worked to save the Everglades and to establish Royal Palm Park and to establish a lovely hotel at the park. This became the nucleus of later Everglades State Park. Moving forward, Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune didn't have the same privileged upbringing. She was born the 15th of 17 children born to previously enslaved parents. When, this is in rural Maysville, South Carolina, when she was a girl, she went with her mother, who was still doing the laundry for the previous slave mistress. And she went with her mother, and she saw some little girls at the house. And she saw some books. And she picked up one of the books and started looking through it and trying to sound out the letters. One of the girls snatched the book out of her hands and said, essentially, to put it as nice as possible, that the books were for white people. This galvanized her to learn to read. Now, at age 9, Bethune could pick 250 pounds of cotton per day. My daughter is 9. This is a little girl, right? 250 pounds. Her labor was vital to the family economy. They were sharecroppers, but she begged her mother to please let her go to a mission school that opened up about 3 miles from their home. And she did. She was the only one allowed to go. She learned to read, and she taught her younger sisters how to read. She taught her older sisters how to read. And then one day she was reading the Bible at home, and her grandmother said that was the first time anyone had read the Bible in the house. Well, she wound up continuing her education at Scotia Seminary, now Scotia College, in North Carolina, which was the first institute of higher education for black women, established in 1867. Then she went on to Moody Bible College in Chicago, and she wanted to be a missionary in Africa. But she learned from the Presbyterian Mission Board that black women were not allowed to serve as missionaries to Africa. So she refocused her efforts and opened up in first Palatka, then Daytona. Isn't this a lovely dress? Opened up a school for girls. And if you look carefully, you could see she's facing the camera, right? She's not even looking at this line, this neat line of girls lined up behind her. I think this tells you something about her leadership style. I can't get one girl to do what I ask her to do. Here she's principal of the school that later became Bethune-Cookman University. Now in this picture, this is the same time that Mae Jennings and other women across Florida were working for suffrage. And she was barred from joining those state women's clubs, joining the state suffrage clubs, because they were segregated by gender. Now, the National Association for Women's Suffrage technically allowed black women to become members, but during the famous 1913 suffrage parade, they were not allowed to march with their states. They had to go to the back. This inspired Bethune, who became known as the first lady of Negro America, to head a suffrage movement, to head a women's club. But beyond that, she had to prepare, or she chose to prepare, not only for black women, but for black men to exercise the right to vote. So she used her school that later became Bethune-Cookman to provide evening literacy classes so that people could, black men and women, could pass the literacy test. She rode around on her bicycle, went door to door collecting for a fund so that black men and women could pay the poll tax. And the KKK heard about what she was doing, and they came to her school with the intention of burning it down. Now, according to Leonard Lempel, who wrote as a history professor with Bethune-Cookman, Bethune led a group of students in song, and essentially they sang the KKK way. And the next morning, she led a mass group of women in exercising their newfound right to vote. Now here, this is from a yearbook from 1954, and you can see Bethune, this is the last year of her life, and she's with her close friend, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was an important friend. So Bethune was the First Lady of Negro America because she achieved the highest rank. Not only was she on the unofficial black cabinet of FDR, she served in a variety of New Deal programs as head. She advised 5 different presidents, and really she was one of the only women to serve as a college president around the world at the time. Here, Eleanor Roosevelt was coming to the Daytona airport so that she could make the commencement address at Bethune-Cookman. Now the final pioneer I'm going to discuss is Mae Tiger Jumper, who also had a rough childhood. There's a controversial term that's still in use that she used in her autobiography, which she wrote with the help of historian Patsy West, who's written extensively about the Seminoles. She and her brother, her younger brother, were known as half-breeds because her mother was Seminole and her father was French. And there were threats on her life and her younger brother's life. So her grandfather intervened and relocated them to the federal reservation. Now, conditions on the reservation were pretty primitive, and she wanted to improve that. She, like Bethune, pleaded with her mother to let her go to a school, in this case, a Cherokee school run by Quakers in North Carolina. She was one of the first Seminoles to get a formal high school education. She talks about the experience in her autobiography. And she also met her husband there. Now, he later came back after they were married, came back from World War II and had PTSD. And he wasn't able to provide for the family. Now, one thing pre-Disney, the Seminoles mastered tourism. In the 1940s, young men could wrestle alligators and receive up to $100 per day as tips. So this was a lucrative profession. Well, her husband couldn't do it. Mae Tiger Jumper wrestled alligators. She writes about it in her autobiography. Beyond that, she went to Oklahoma, got a nursing degree with the idea of coming back to the reservation and improving public health. She became involved with the tribal council and much later became the editor of the Seminole Tribune and turned it into one of the best Native American newspapers in the nation. But more importantly, she became elected the first and only female Seminole tribal chair. Moreover, she was the first female tribal chair of any American Indian nation. So I hope these tales of Florida's female pioneers have inspired you. Whatever obstacles we're concerned about today, think of what these women did with no air conditioning and bigger mosquitoes. Thank you for coming out tonight. To have both Archie and Marjorie Carr, but the more research I've done, I think we need to add Mary McLeod Bethune to the mix. And I really like to have all these women at my table. I could never pick a favorite. But in terms of Marjorie Carr, she was the subject of my doctoral dissertation in my book because my mother grew up with their daughter, Mimi. Oh. So I had unprecedented access to photos, stories. I read their love letters that had been sealed with time and humidity. Archie Carr is such a romantic.
Aww.
I think there's another question.
Yes, regarding Mary McLeod Bethune, could you tell me possibly, do you have any inside information about statuary hall
to be added to the National Statuary Hall. She will be the first commissioned statue of an African American woman to go inside the hall. I saw pictures of it being worked on in Italy. Again, this is the year it's supposed to happen, but I can't find any information on whether this will be the year. You know, we had heard that Harriet Tubman would be added to the $20 bill, and we know what happened with that. So I hope this is the year that that happens. And also as a follow-up, Mae Tiger Jumper, there's a hospital being constructed with her name at the Hollywood Reservation. So another way to honor one of these women. Any other questions?
Well, I'll just redeem myself real quick. The exhibit is called The Ballot and the Brush, Celebrating Women's Suffrage Through Art. I can't believe I stumbled on that. Opens tomorrow. We'll hope to see a lot of you there. And I did want to recognize Emily Liska, who just asked that wonderful question. She is the past executive director of the Jacksonville Historical Society and is now the president of the Florida Historical Society. And she has a program coming up on March. I'm not saying that. She is just a wonderful person, and we are glad to have her. Thank you, Dr. Peggy Macdonald, for coming out. Thank you all. I think we're ahead of the rain, so if you'd like to fill out a survey, please do that real quickly and drive safely home, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for coming out today.
Really